All right, hello, welcome and felcha to Random Thoughts from County Antrim. I'm your host, David McDonnell, and this is my half hour throughout the pandemic, which is winding down, hopefully, let's hope. But throughout the pandemic, every Sunday I tell a half hour of stories, historical information, some yarns, and as always, my random thoughts. So I was wondering this week, have you ever heard the story of King O'Toole? No? Well, then I shall tell it to you. 'Cause I thought the entire world had heard of King O'Toole. Well, as you must know, if you didn't before, there was a king called King O'Toole. And he was a fine man in ancient times, and he was the right sort of man, you see. And as a young man, he loved sport as much as he loved life, and hunting in particular, and fishing was his favorite pastime, and he would go out to hunt or to fish with the rising of the sun. And away he went over the mountains after the deer or whatever game he could find, or to the brook to catch some fish. Those were fine, fine times indeed for King O'Toole. And that was all fine and good when the king had his health. But of course, over time, the king grew old. And by that reason, he was stiff in the joints and in his limbs, and his heart began to fail. One of those things that happen with aging, and truth be told, the same sort of thing is happening to the teller of this tale to you. The limbs get sore and the muscles, and I'm just not able to do the things I used to do. And the same, sad to say, was happening to King O'Toole. Now, diverted from his passions, the old king was obliged to get a goose for his diversion. And you might laugh at that if you like, but truth is exactly as I'm telling you. And this is how the goose diverted the king. Now, the goose used to swim along the lake and go diving for trout. And each Friday, the goose caught a trout and gave it to the king. And on every other day, the goose flew around the lake. And the king just enjoyed watching the goose fly around the lake. And he particularly liked the trout that the goose caught for him every Friday. Now, this went on for quite some time, and it was all well and good until the goose was struck by age, just like King O'Toole. The goose could no longer fly around the lake and was no longer as adept at catching the trout. And so he no longer could divert the king. And the king was now lost entirely. Now, one morning the king was walking by the edge of the lake, and he was kind of lamenting his poor fate. Without any diversion in life, he wondered whether he could even go on living. And all of a sudden, a young man approached him. "God save you," said King O'Toole to the young man. "And God save you, King O'Toole," said the young man. "'Tis true, I am King O'Toole, but how did you know that?" He says, "Oh, never mind," said Saint Kevin. You see, it was not a boy, after all. It was St. Kevin himself, in disguise, and nobody else. "Never you mind," said Kevin, "for I know more than that. May I be so bold as to ask, how is your goose?" "Goodness," said King O'Toole, "how did you come about to know about my goose?" "Well, no matter," said Kevin. "I was given to understand it." And after some further conversation, the king finally asked, he says, "What are you?" He says, "Well, I am an honest man, said Kevin. He says, well, honest man, how is it that you make your money? Well, I make my money, said Kevin, by making old things as good as new. Is it a tinker you are? Asked the king. No, said the saint, I am no tinker by trade. I have a better trade than that. What would you say if I could make your old goose as good as new? Now the thought of his goose as good as new made the king positively giddy. He whistled for his goose, and the old goose kind of waddled up to him as slowly as you would expect of an old goose. And then the saint looked straight into the eyes of the goose and said, I'll do this job for you, King O'Toole. Well, if you do that, then I will tell everyone I know that you are the cleverest man in all of Ireland. Oh, but you must do more than that, said Kevin. I will not do this job for nothing. What will you give me if I do this job for you? Well, I will give you whatever you asked, said King O'Toole. Now that's the way to do business, said Kevin. Now this is the bargain I have for you. Will you give me all of the ground beneath that which the goose flies, after I make this goose as good as new? I will, said King O'Toole. And you won't go back on your word, said Kevin. He says, I will not, said the king. I am good for my word. Well, then it's a bargain, said Kevin. And then Kevin looked at the goose and said, come here. I will make you a sporting bird. And with that, Kevin lifted up the bird with the two wings, one wing on each hand. And the goose tried to flap. And then Kevin released the bird, and the bird began to fly. And he was flying as high as eagles. And he began to turn and twist as sharply as any bird in the sky. And it was a beautiful sight for anyone to see, but it was especially beautiful for King O'Toole. For his old goose flew as good as it ever did. Now when the goose landed on its feet, the king said to it, oh, to the goose, he's looking at the goose, he said, oh, but you are the darling of the world. And what do you say to me for making your goose that way? Asked Kevin. Well, I say again, you are the cleverest man in all of Ireland. And do you say more than that? Asked Kevin. He says, well, said the king, I am beholden to you. But will you give me all of the ground beneath which the goose had just flown? Asked Kevin. And the king said, I will, and you are welcome to it. Although, truth be told, it's the last acre that I own. But you'll keep your word? Asked Kevin. As true can be, said King O'Toole. And to that, Kevin replied, it is well that you, King O'Toole, for if you did not, the goose would never fly again. And with the king being good to his word, St. Kevin was pleased with him, and he made himself known to the king. He said, King O'Toole, you are a decent man, for I only came here to test you. You don't know me since I am disguised. Musha, said the king, who are you? He says, I am St. Kevin, was Kevin's reply. Oh, heaven, said the king, and he fell onto his knees. He said, it is the great St. Kevin that I've been talking to all of this time without even knowing it. And Kevin said, yes, I am Kevin, St. Kevin. And so the king got his goose as good as new to divert him as long as he lived. And the saint continued to support the king after coming onto the property, now that the saint Kevin owned all of the realm that was formerly that of King O'Toole. Because indeed, the goose had flown over the entire realm. And that continued until the date of the king's death. And it wasn't long thereafter, truth be told. Because the goose once thought it was catching a trout on a Friday for the king. The goose landed in the water and grabbed what he thought was a trout. But it wasn't a trout, it was an eel. Instead of the goose killing a trout for the king, it was the eel who caught the goose and killed the goose. And without the goose to provide the king with his diversion, the old king died soon thereafter. Now that's the story of the king and his goose, and that's the way the story usually ends. And it's an old Celtic tale. And I suppose there's a moral in there. The moral is that one should always keep his promise, and that a deal is a deal, a bargain is a bargain. But it's not much of a moral, though, because keeping his promise didn't do much for King O'Toole for very long. I mean, it did him some good for a short period of time, but not in the long run, because he died shortly after making that deal, as did his goose. Now, to me, the most... 1 second, please. To me, the most interesting part of the story is that of St. Kevin. Now, there really was a St. Kevin. He's the patron saint of Dublin, and he's known as Kevin of Glendalough. And Glendalough is in County Wicklow. It's a valley, was created by a glacier. And it's the site of a monastery founded by Kevin in the 6th century. And the monastery is still there, but in Kevin's day and for centuries thereafter, it was more than a monastery. It was a whole community, entire community built there. Included workshops and guest houses, and infirmary, farm buildings. There was a large working farm, and many dwellings. It was a little town, little village, centered around the monastery. Now, the Annals of Ireland, which I've referred to in the past, the Annals kind of record Irish history, and particularly they record the births and deaths and great deeds of the great people of Ireland. And it's recorded, the Annals record the deaths of many abbots and bishops at Glendalough. And my guess is that Glendalough became a haven, particularly for old priests. The monastery and the community was some sort of religious retirement community, and an old folks' home for bishops and abbots, so that many died there, not from any extracurricular activities, but just because they went there when they were old. So from whom, here's the question, from whom did Kevin acquire the land for this monastery and for the Glendalough community? What's the answer to that question? You might have guessed that it was the O'Tooles, that the land came from the O'Tooles. And if you guessed that, you would be incorrect. Now, the O'Tooles were a powerful clan, and they claimed large tracts of land in what is now County Kildare, which is west of Dublin. And they were removed from those lands by the English and the Normans in about the 11th century. And by the 12th century, they settled in the Wicklow Mountains, in and around Glendalough. And they remained in Glendalough for many centuries, and they were a fiercely independent clan. Dublin became the center of English rule of Ireland, but the English in and around Dublin rarely headed south into the Wicklow Mountains for fear of running into the O'Tooles. Now, as you may have noticed, the timing of all of that doesn't quite match. Saint Kevin, founded the monastery in the 6th century. The O'Tooles didn't move to the Wicklow Mountains and to Glendalough till about the 12th century. So there's another reason, though, to believe that St. Kevin and King O'Toole never met. And that is that there were no O'Tooles, period, in the 6th century. Now, there was a clan, of course, which lived, as I said, at that time in County Kildare, but they were not known as the O'Tooles. Now, the clans, I think I've explained this in prior podcasts. I certainly explained it in Clandonnell about the evolution of clans and the clan culture. But the Celtic clans were fluid, flexible arrangements, and they changed over time. They were simply a group of people living in and around the same region, and people who recognized a common history and a common ancestry, and a common leadership and communal structure. And all of that would change over time, and certainly over generations or so, over centuries. The nature of that clan would change over time. And the names of the clans, a clan, would change over time as well. There never was an official naming ceremony. People within a clan simply referred to themselves in a particular way, and outsiders would refer to a particular clan in a particular way, and that sort of became their name. And clans often referred to themselves by the name of their chief, the name of the clan chief, or perhaps the name of an ancient clan chief, or by the name of a deceased hero of the clan, and that's how they became known. So if an ancient chief of a clan was named Brian, the clan might be known as the O'Brien, or the descendants of Brian. If the current chief was named Donald, the clan might be referred to as the O'Donnells, or the McDonnells, as descendants or sons of Donald. Now, the source of the O'Toole name, at least in this region of Ireland, is this. And there was a man named Gwyer Alela, who became the king of Leinster. And he was from the clan which eventually became known as the O'Tooles. And his name was referred to as Gwyer Mac Alila, which is Gwyer, son of Alila. And he was killed in a battle against the Vikings. Now, Gwyer had a son named Toole, and that's spelled Tuathal, but it's pronounced Toole, pretty close to Toole. So Toole was known as Toole Mac Gwyer, Toole, son of Gwyer. And Toole likewise became king of Leinster. Now, Toole had a son named Gwyer, who likewise became king of Leinster. So that's 3 generations in a row, which became the king of Leinster. Now, Gwyer obviously was named after his grandfather. His grandfather was Gwyer, his father was Toole, and he was named Gwyer. And he was referred to as Gwyer Mac Toole, Gwyer, son of Toole. Now, within a generation or so, the descendants of those men became known as the O'Tooles, descendant of Toole. And it was about this time, at about the 12th century, that people throughout Europe, actually, were acquiring last names. And in the Celtic world, most people adopted as their last name the name of their clan. And so the people in this clan adopted the last name of O'Toole. So there you see, there wasn't anybody running around in the Wicklow Mountains by the name of O'Toole during the period of time in which St. Kevin was there. But I think I can see how the story evolved. This story, King O'Toole and His Goose, is known as a peasant's tale. Many peasants' tale in Ireland. It's called that because it's one of the many types of stories, one of the many stories told by peasants as they sat around the fire. Sometimes these stories had a moral, sometimes they did not. Sometimes they were tales about the clan and the clan's history, and sometimes not. But my guess is that this story originated in the land of the O'Tooles, in and around Glendalough, in the Wicklow Mountains. And the original storyteller wanted to tell a tale about a good King O'Toole. And he also wanted to tell a tale about the saintly Kevin. So he put the two characters together, and he added a goose just for a little bit of lighthearted humor. And he probably delighted his audience with the tale of the goose. And in the process of doing that, he also explained how it came to be that Kevin owned so much land in Glendalough, and why the monastery was located in Glendalough. It was fiction, of course, but who cares? It was a wonderful story for a storyteller to tell around the fire. I read a lot of commentaries about some of these old stories, and I read one which said that this story made no sense. And I think he came to that conclusion because the king kept his promise by giving the land to Kevin. But the king did not live happily ever after for having kept his part of the bargain. And the commentator kind of came to the conclusion that these types of stories didn't have to make sense. They were simply entertaining for peasants. But I think the story does make sense, not because of the moral or the purported moral. I think it made some sense because it explained kind of a verbal picture of a good king, of a good saint, and even a good goose, and explains how the good people of the O'Toole clan came to live so close to a retirement community for priests. So that's my explanation for the story, and as to why it does indeed make sense. That's my explanation, and I'm going to stick to it. So that's the end of the podcast today. We talked about a depressing subject last week. I may go to, and I promised a more lighthearted discussion this week. We see what we have in store next week. But please take a look at my website. I've been taking a lot of these old stories that I've heard over the years and writing them down and finding some images and posting it on my website. So I've got, this one will be on the website sometime this week. The other old tales I've told, I've been putting on my website. So take a look at my website at clandonald.net, and you'll see some of these stories and some of the whimsical illustrations I was able to find. Not drawn by me, because I can't draw. So look at my website. If you have any questions, comments, requests, send them to me at clandonald@gmail.com. Take a look at my Facebook page. And like it and share it so I can get the word out that I'm here telling stories despite the coronavirus. And like this video so that people on YouTube might be steered to it if they want to hear an old tale. So that's the end of the podcast today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.